How do you even explain her? The easiest way people keep landing on is calling her Kobe Bryant with a ponytail, and honestly, that's not far off. It's that same cold-blooded, apex predator mentality, the kind of player who doesn't just want to beat you, but wants to take something from you mentally every time you step on the floor. And the wild part is every arena she walks into feels different, like the energy shifts before she even touches the ball, like everyone in the building knows they're about to witness something. That matters, and that's exactly why what's happening around her right now feels so frustrating, because instead of a league cleanly building on that kind of once-in-a-generation momentum, it feels like it's stumbling over itself in real time. And that's not exaggeration, that's reality. Because opportunities like this don't come around often in sports. You don't just casually get handed a player who doesn't only dominate headlines, but actually changes the economic conversation around your entire league, bringing in new viewers, boosting ratings, increasing sponsorship leverage, and even influencing collective bargaining discussions. That's not normal growth. That's a surge, a shift, something transformational. And yet somehow the response to that momentum feels scattered, disjointed, almost like there's no unified vision behind the scenes. Because while one side is seeing the numbers rise and the attention explode, another side seems caught up in internal noise, in narratives, in conflicts that are pulling the focus away from what actually matters. And that's where things start to feel unstable, because instead of the conversation being about basketball, about skill, about competition, it's drifting into perception battles. Fan frustration, media tension, and organizational missteps. And perception in sports is just as powerful as performance, sometimes even more, because perception shapes how fans engage, how sponsors invest, and how long momentum lasts. And right now that perception is starting to crack, especially when you look at the Indiana Fever, a franchise sitting on what should be a goldmine of visibility and opportunity. And yet the messaging coming out of that organization doesn't feel aligned with what fans are actually responding to. It feels disconnected, like they're speaking a different language than the audience that's fueling their growth. Because here's the reality. And it's not complicated. Caitlin Clark isn't just a popular player. She's a ratings engine. She's a force multiplier. You put her in a game and casual viewers show up. Analysts start talking. Social media lights up. Engagement spikes, and that's measurable impact, that's leverage, that's something leagues spend decades trying to build. And when fans feel like that kind of impact isn't being respected or maximized, they don't just shrug it off. They react, they push back, and eventually, if that disconnect continues, they disengage, and that's the dangerous part. Because once fans start walking away, it's incredibly hard to bring them back, and that's where the current tension really sits, because it's not just about one decision or one moment. It's about a pattern of signals that fans are picking up on. Whether it's players taking shots at the audience, fans firing back, or viral moments that shift the narrative away from the game itself, like when teams shut down media access or create unnecessary friction, suddenly the spotlight isn't on performance anymore, it's on controversy, and that's not sustainable for a league trying to grow. And then you add in leadership responses, like social media posts that categorize fans into types of complainers, labeling some as productive and others as toxic, or even suggesting removal, and it comes off less like engagement and more like dismissal. And historically, across every industry, that's never been a winning strategy. Because when audiences feel like their voice doesn't matter, they don't fight harder to be heard, they leave. They take their attention, their money, and their energy somewhere else. And that's the tightrope the league is walking right now, balancing growth with alienation. And the truth is, you can't build on new fans while simultaneously pushing them away. That contradiction doesn't hold. It collapses under its own weight. And that's why reactions are so intense right now, because fans aren't just reacting to one draft pick or one comment. They're reacting to what feels like a broader disconnect between what they're investing in and how that investment is being treated. And at the center of that storm is the Indiana Fever. Because this is a team that should be capitalizing more effectively than anyone else, and instead, decisions like the Raven Johnson situation have created a flashpoint, not necessarily because of the player herself, but because of what the move represents to the fan base, which is a perceived lack of alignment. with what they believe the team needs, and people can say that professionals will work things out, that chemistry will develop, and that's probably true on a surface level, because elite players adapt. They always do, but that's not what the frustration is about. It's about process, about decision-making, about whether the organization is actually listening to the signals being sent by its own audience, and when those signals are ignored or brushed aside, it creates resentment, and when resentment builds, it turns into narrative, and once a narrative takes hold, it's incredibly difficult to reverse, because every new decision gets filtered through that lens of doubt, and that's where the Fever find themselves now, not just defending a single move, but trying to convince fans that everything is fine while the perception continues to drift in the opposite direction. And that's the core issue here, perception versus intent, because internally the organization might believe it's making the right calls, building the right roster, maintaining the right culture, but externally, the message isn't landing, and in sports, if the message isn't landing with fans, it might as well not exist. Because fan engagement is the lifeblood of the entire system. It drives revenue, visibility, and long-term stability, and right now that connection feels strained, and that strain is what people are reacting to, not just emotionally, but logically. Because they can see the opportunity sitting right there, clear as day, and they're watching it get mishandled in ways that feel avoidable, and that's what makes it so frustrating, because this isn't about tearing something down, it's about wanting to see it succeed. Wanting to see a league with real momentum actually maximize that moment instead of diluting it with unnecessary distractions, and that's the conversation that needs to happen, not in a defensive way, not in a dismissive way, but in a way that acknowledges what's at stake. Because at the end of the day, talent alone isn't enough. Even generational talent needs structure, alignment, and smart decision-making around it to truly elevate a league. And if that foundation keeps cracking, no amount of star power can fully compensate for it, and that's the crossroads this situation is approaching, where the next set of decisions will determine whether this momentum becomes something lasting or just another missed opportunity in the long history of sports leagues failing to capitalize on their biggest stars. And if you're following this entire breakdown and want more deep dive analysis like this, make sure you stay locked in with Basketball Fan, because this is exactly where these conversations are going to keep unfolding. Then you've got Lynn Dunn stepping in with messaging that fans clearly took as dismissive, and here's the thing fans notice, they always do, there's no slipping anything past them when they're emotionally and financially invested. And that's the part organizations keep underestimating. You don't get to ignore them, talk past them, or categorize them into neat little boxes and expect everything to be fine, because that's not how sports works. Not at any level where passion actually matters. And what made this situation escalate so quickly is how that messaging landed in real time, because instead of feeling like leadership was listening, it felt like leadership was labeling, and the second that shift happens, the relationship between team and fan base starts to crack, because fans don't want to be managed, they want to be heard. They don't want to be told what type of complainer they are. They want to know that their voice actually carries weight, especially when they're the ones driving ticket sales, merchandise, engagement, and the overall momentum of a league that's still trying to establish long-term stability. And once those fans feel dismissed, everything changes. Because now the conversation isn't just about basketball decisions anymore, it becomes about respect, about accountability, about whether the people in charge actually understand the ecosystem they're operating in. And that's exactly what you saw explode across reactions, because people weren't just pushing back on one comment. They were reacting to a pattern, a tone, a perception that the front office wasn't aligned with the very audience fueling its growth, and the responses reflected that frustration in a raw, unfiltered way. With fans saying things like they recognize gaslighting when they see it, questioning whether labeling complainers was just a way to avoid accountability, pointing out the difference between leaders who listen and leaders who don't, and emphasizing that complaining doesn't automatically equal hate. Sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes it's the most invested supporters sounding the alarm because they see something going wrong, and that nuance is where organizations often fail. Because it's easier to dismiss criticism than it is to engage with it honestly, but that shortcut comes with a cost, and that cost is trust, because once trust starts eroding, every decision gets questioned, every move gets second-guessed, and every message gets filtered through skepticism. And that's exactly where the Indiana Fever find themselves right now, caught in a loop where they're not just defending their choices, they're defending their credibility, and that's a much harder battle to win. Because credibility isn't built through statements, it's built through consistency, through alignment between what you say and what you do. And when fans look at this situation, they're not seeing that alignment, they're seeing contradictions, they're seeing a franchise with a generational draw in Caitlin Clark making moves that don't seem tailored to maximize her strengths. And that disconnect is what's fueling the backlash. Because from the outside looking in, it feels like the opportunity is obvious. Build around your star. Optimize her skill set. Create a system that amplifies what makes her special. And yet the decisions being made aren't clearly reflecting that approach. And when fans point that out, instead of being met with transparency, they feel like they're being categorized or dismissed. And that's where frustration turns into something louder, something sharper. Because sports fans are emotional by nature. That's not a flaw. That's the entire foundation of the industry, whether you're talking about the NFL, the NBA, or Major League Baseball. Fans are loud, they're passionate, they're critical, and yes, sometimes they're harsh. But that's the price of relevance. That's what comes with having people care deeply about what you're doing. And if you want to be treated like a top-tier league, you have to accept that level of scrutiny. You don't get to pick and choose when fan intensity is valid. It's all part of the same ecosystem. And the moment you start pushing back against that intensity instead of channeling it, you create distance instead of trust, and that distance is dangerous. Because it leads to disengagement, and disengagement is the one thing a growing league can't afford, because once fans stop caring, once they stop watching, once they stop spending, momentum disappears faster than it was built. And that's why some of the most telling reactions weren't even the loudest ones, but the quieter warnings, the ones saying be glad people are still complaining, because that means they still care, because when the complaints stop, that's when irrelevance creeps back in. And that's a reality every sports organization should take seriously, because apathy is far more damaging than criticism, and yet the way this situation unfolded made it feel like criticism itself was the problem, rather than a signal worth examining. And that misread is what keeps amplifying the tension, because instead of de-escalating, it pours fuel on the fire. It reinforces the perception that the front office isn't listening, that it's more focused on controlling the narrative than understanding it. And once that perception takes hold, it becomes self-sustaining, because every new decision feeds into it, including the draft situation involving Raven Johnson, which became another flashpoint not necessarily because of the player herself, but because of the context surrounding the move, the timing, the perceived fit, and even the optics, like her multi-year deal with Adidas right before everything unfolded, which led some fans to speculate that the outcome wasn't as unexpected as it was presented, and whether that speculation is accurate or not almost becomes secondary, because perception is what drives the conversation. And the perception here is that the decision didn't align with what the roster actually needed, because if you look at the Fever objectively, the most glaring gap isn't at guard, it's in size, in interior presence, in having players who can control the paint, set physical screens, rebound consistently, and finish efficiently around the rim. The kind of players who naturally complement a playmaker like Clark, who thrives on creating opportunities, threading passes, and pushing tempo. And when those complementary pieces aren't prioritized, it raises questions about the overall strategy, about whether the roster is being constructed with a clear vision in mind or whether it's a series of disconnected decisions. And that's where fans start listing alternatives, pointing out available prospects, highlighting missed opportunities, and reinforcing the idea that the path forward seems obvious from the outside, which only intensifies frustration when the organization doesn't appear to be on the same page. And again, that frustration isn't coming from nowhere. It's a direct response to what people are seeing on the court and off it, and when that response gets labeled as negativity or toxicity, it creates a feedback loop where fans feel even more unheard, even more dismissed, and therefore even more vocal. And that's the cycle playing out right now, one where criticism is met with defensiveness instead of dialogue, and the result is a widening gap between the team and its supporters, and that gap shows up in everything, in declining patience, in sharper commentary, in calls for accountability, in demands for transparency, like asking for a clear explanation of the team's direction, because at the end of the day, that's what fans really want: clarity, a sense that there's a plan, that decisions are part of a larger strategy rather than isolated moves, and when that clarity is missing, people fill in the blanks themselves, often with the worst possible assumptions, because uncertainty breeds doubt, and doubt spreads quickly in an environment already charged with emotion. And that's why this moment feels bigger than just one controversy, because it's exposing a fundamental tension in how the organization communicates and operates, and that tension is magnified by the presence of a player like Clark, whose impact raises expectations across the board, because when you have a generational talent, the margin for error shrinks, every decision matters more, every misstep is more visible, and every disconnect is amplified. And that's the reality the Fever are navigating right now, whether they acknowledge it or not, and the path forward isn't complicated in theory, but it requires a shift in approach, a willingness to engage rather than dismiss, to listen rather than label, to align messaging with action, and to build in a way that clearly supports the strengths of the player who's driving so much of the league's current momentum, because talent alone isn't enough. It never has been. It needs structure. It needs cohesion. It needs intentional decision-making around it, and without that, even the biggest opportunities can slip away, and that's what makes this situation so critical, because it's not just about fixing one issue. It's about resetting the relationship between team and fan base before the disconnect becomes permanent, before frustration turns into apathy, before momentum fades into missed potential. And that's why conversations like this matter, because they're not just criticism for the sake of noise. They're a reflection of investment, of people wanting to see this succeed, wanting to see a league and a franchise capitalize on what's right in front of them instead of letting it unravel. And if you're following all of this and want more real, unfiltered breakdowns of what's actually happening in the game, make sure you stay locked in with Basketball Fan, because this is where the real conversations continue to unfold.